Hi, welcome back to another live stream with the Global Network. It's our new show called Space Alert that airs every month. The Global Network was created in 1992 to prevent the arms race from moving into space. And please remember to support the show by clicking the like button and also subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you click on the icon that shows a bell, you can be notified every time we upload a new video. You can also participate in this live stream by leaving a comment in the chat section. And also, if you want to get involved, please check out our website, spaceforpeace.org. We'd love to organize with you. And on today's show, we want to welcome our guest, Christian Sorensen, who lives in New England. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We also want to thank Global Network board member Will Griffin for doing the tech work to make this whole show possible. Christian, please tell us briefly about yourself.
I was in the military until 2011, got out and continued a path of self-education and began to understand that the U.S. government is the leading purveyor of violence in the world, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, and started researching the Pentagon's contracts, which they post every day, every duty day on their website around 5 p.m. And since then, I've accumulated a fair amount of information regarding who profits from war, what the corporations are, where they're located, and what they're working on. And so I try to use the information provided by the Pentagon in order to educate as many people as possible about the war industry, the corporations that design, market, and sell goods and services to the U.S. military, to intelligence agencies, and to capitalist allies around the world.
Which branch of the service were you in?
I was in the Air Force.
Oh, I was too. During the Vietnam War. That's where I became a peace activist, actually.
Good man.
You too. We recently saw you in action on a webinar here in Maine where you talked about Maine's reliance on Pentagon dollars. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more communities around the country that are essentially addicted to military production money. Isn't that true?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, Congress plays a large role in that, getting the bribery in the form of campaign finance and lobbyists from the war industry. And then they, keep the money flowing by funding the Pentagon and intelligence agencies at ever increasing rates and amounts.
Well, what are the leading aerospace corporations today that are driving this arms race into space?
So for the most part, the leading corporations profiting from the militarization of space are the leading corporations in general profiting from war. And we know them: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and L3 Harris. Those are the top six. Those are the big ones. By far and away, they hog the biggest portion of the amount of money that the Pentagon spends on contractors, quote unquote contractors. So I would say that corporate America, so there are many different business sectors of war. That is to say, different areas in which corporate America profits off of war. So sometimes it is running a given base, what's called base operations. Sometimes it's information technology. These are different business sectors of war. Space is a very profitable business sector of war. And corporate America has taken over, as we've seen, and as many of your videos at the Global Network have shown, more and more military functions, and particularly in space. So corporate America runs the launch sites. It builds the satellites. It then launches the satellites. These are all corporate functions. And it carries out a lot of the military functions at military bases that are focused on space. So Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado, Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, Los Angeles Air Force Base in Los Angeles, California. And it designs and runs the ground-based systems that then monitor space activity, whether it's monitoring the satellites or monitoring potential enemy launches of nuclear weapons. So it has the entire gamut covered. And I'm happy to talk in much more detail if you want about all of those and who does each of that and where they're located if you want.
Well, take a minute and delve into it a little bit more, because I think it's really important.
Okay.
And particularly the relationship between the ground stations, or what are sometimes called the downlink stations.
Okay.
Talk to the satellites, that whole process.
Okay.
Talk a bit more about that.
Okay, and feel free to cut me off at any point.
Now,
So
if you see me do this.
All right. So let's start with the launch sites. So the two main launch sites are in Florida at Cape Canaveral, and then on the Pacific is Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. If you picture California in your mind, it's right at sort of the elbow of California in, I think it's Santa Barbara County, but I'm not sure. It's right there. And so those are the two spots where the U.S. military launches the satellites, but corporate America is in charge of that whole process. So at the launch sites, corporations run the sites. Even prior to launch, corporations are in charge. And so one of these corporations is a joint venture between Raytheon and General Dynamics, and it's called RG Next, or Range Generation Next. And it does all the launch prep, some infrastructure, IT infrastructure. You also have increasingly and quite distressingly, quote unquote, small businesses who are able to contract. And one example is Manu Kai LLC, and it runs some base operations at those bases as well. So just sort of the general day-to-day, taking out the trash, keeping the airfields clear, that type of thing. So you have the launch sites being maintained and run and functioning as a result of corporate activity. So corporations have captured that. Then it comes to the launching of the satellites. That's a corporate activity as well. And you're familiar with both of these. SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's venture, is a fairly recent entry into the field. I think it had its first contract from the Pentagon regarding space launch in maybe 2016. Before that, and continuing to this day, the dominant provider is a joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Boeing called United Launch Services, or United Launch Alliance sometimes. So those are the two. If you have a satellite, a military satellite or an espionage satellite being launched by the Air Force, or what is now the domain of the Space Force, or for the National Reconnaissance Office, which is basically the espionage agency in charge of satellites, the launching entity is corporate America, and it's SpaceX or United Launch Services. Now, what's his name? Jeff Bezos has a satellite launch provider called Blue Origin, and it's not. It's involved in some activity, but to my knowledge, to this point, and I haven't looked this up, so the viewers should look this up. To my knowledge, to this point, it has not yet done space launches for the Pentagon or the National Reconnaissance Office, but it is in the market, and it is posturing itself and looking to market its services that way. Then you have the monitoring locations on the ground, and these corporations doing that include L3Harris, which we mentioned. It sells corporate personnel and advisory and assistance services to Space Force at Peterson Air Force Base, which we mentioned was in Colorado, Schriever Air Force Base, and Buckley Air Force Base. Then you have an Alaskan Native corporation called Chugach, Chugach, which does some of the radar tracking, some of the space surveillance, the telemetry. And then you have Indine, which is another corporation. Indine is located in Sterling, Virginia. Northern Virginia, as you know, is home to most concentrated war corporate activity in the United States. And it's there for a couple of reasons. One is because there are military and intelligence installations there that corporate America is looking to profit from, but also because it's a stone throw from Capitol Hill where the money is. Yeah. And so Indine is located in Sterling, Virginia. It operates the solid state phased array radar, which is one of these systems around the country and in Greenland as well, and in the United Kingdom, that looks up into space to provide what they call, situational awareness, basically what's going on up there. And
jump in here.
Sure.
We're going to want to move along.
Yeah.
But basically, what you're describing to me indicates that we have to have endless war in this country in order to fuel our economy. Would you briefly comment on that?
In the current structural arrangement, yes. It doesn't have to be this way. We could be, instead of having a war industry as one of our primary industries in the United States, we could have an industry in any field. We could be the best at education. We could be the best at infrastructure. We could be the best at healthcare. We could be, we could do what Cuba does and send doctors around the world and taking care of people. But we, and by we I mean our political class and our ruling class, the capitalist ruling class in this country, has made a choice ever since World War II to sustain and be a part of a permanent warfare state.
Well, that leads me to the next question I want to ask you is, which politicians from both parties now are leading advocates for space weapons technology, and also are the largest recipients of campaign donations from these weapons corporations?
So both capitalist factions, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are institutional supporters of the militarization of space. And sure, there are politicians who advocate for militarization of space who accept campaign finance and lobbying in return for their acquiescence to war industry domination. You can see this, for example, in Colorado's 5th and 6th congressional district, home to serious war industry infrastructure. Now, remember, again, there are Space Force bases there, Schriever, Buckley, and Peterson. But it's more than that. And the war corporations swarm to those bases, and they often set up shop in and around those districts. But these politicians in, for example, Colorado's 5th and 6th congressional districts are confined more than not by the war industry's use of the jobs card. So the war industry will say, hey, we're bringing jobs to your district, and the capitalist politician's job is to go along with that, regardless of whether the war industry provides good jobs or well-paying jobs or a lot of jobs, as we have seen in multiple studies lately from Brown University's Cost of War Project and Professor Peltier at Boston University, and the Political Economy Research Institute up at UMass Amherst. There are many other ways to provide better jobs, including healthcare, infrastructure, education. Those are greater job producers than the war industry. So we've seen that, but the politicians don't care. Their job is to play along. They say, "Oh, jobs. Oh, okay," and they don't want to push back against the war industry, in large part because they owe their position to the war industry. So it's all part of the game. Now, executives of war corporations know that they've captured Congress in many ways. Jobs, we know. Campaign finance, we know. Lobbying, we know. So it's a combination of that. So the reason I bring this up is because I could sit here and list off the names of politicians, but politicians come and go. And so there's no need to focus on who occupies what seat in the House, for example, right now, because electing new people to that seat won't change a thing. Because as we've seen with some progressives in, for example, New York City elected to the House, if we're actually serious about changing the status quo, then the structural problems must be addressed. And the war industry must be addressed. And creating a new economic system must happen. Otherwise, we could put the most progressive politician in the world in a war industry district, and they will continue to do their job as a politician which in capitalism is to aid and abet corporate profit.
That's
That's what I want to focus on.
That's what we see here in Maine, in the 1st Congressional District, Representative Shelley Pingree, a Democrat. Fantastic on every issue, except when it comes to military production. She is first in line, on her knees, begging for money for Bath Iron Works, for the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And she won't move off that for nothing. So it's definitely real. I want to mention that there's a flurry of spaceport construction proposals and actual construction going on around the world now because of all the tens of thousands of launches of mini satellites for 5G, which is going to have serious military implications. But one of them I want to mention is Rocket Lab in New Zealand. The people there were promised that it was going to be a civilian launch facility. Lockheed Martin has now taken it over, and they're launching military missions. So isn't this something that is really happening everywhere these days?
Yes, and the conflict always spirals upwards. There's never any de-escalation. So as soon as corporate America finds a new business sector of war, or creates it out of thin air, as we've seen with the long-running militarization of space, as it didn't have to be that way. As soon as corporate America gets in there, then it is off to the races. We saw that with drones. Drones didn't always exist. We saw that with drones, and now they're saying, we have to build drones and we have to export them to our capitalist allies. Otherwise, the Chinese and the Russians will do it. Or now that we have drones, we got to build counter drones, counter UAS, counter unmanned aerial systems. Why? Because, the bad guys have the drones, so now we got to be able to defend against it. And you see that with space as well, with intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles. And say, we were the first to develop all of this technology. We were the only nation to detonate nuclear weapons against an enemy. And now that nuclear proliferation has occurred, we got to now develop anti-ballistic missile systems in order to allegedly knock these incoming missiles out of the sky. So the conflict is always spiraling upward toward profit, actually.
How about internationally? What can you say about what the aerospace corporations are doing internationally promoting Star Wars?
So Star Wars, I should first define. Star Wars is it's a pipe dream. It's an incredibly costly project to use weapons based on the ground and in space in order to allegedly protect the United States from incoming ballistic missiles, which are nuclear weapons. Now, this is why we have to hype up the alleged threat from North Korea or Russia or China or Iran, regardless of whether they have the technology. The war industry and the Pentagon, for its part, seizes upon these pretexts, hypes them in order to justify, at least on the Pentagon's end, budgets and bureaucratic legal authorities, and then the war industry for the end result of profit. Now, the current iteration of Star Wars is the Missile Defense Agency, MDA. So MDA utilizes war industry products in order to hit ballistic missiles when they take off, and then when they're in the middle of flight, and then when they're descending. And I'm happy to get into which products those are. But you asked about which corporations, the corporations militarizing space vis-a-vis Star Wars. So that mostly happens within the United States. Star Wars is mostly a U.S. scheme. There are other war corporations, for example, in Western Europe, that have their own space portfolios, but in terms of breadth and in terms of dollars flowing through them, it's nothing compared to the U.S. war industry. I mean, the U.S. war industry is the premier war industry in the world. So, for example, there's Leonardo DRS in Italy, there's Thales in France, Safran in France, Kongsberg in, I believe it's Norway. There's Saab in Sweden, BAE Systems in the UK, Rolls-Royce in the UK. All of these have some foot in the space business sector of war, but they're not even close to the militarization of space when compared to the big boys in the United States, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and L3Harris.
But the cost is so great. They've been saying for years that Star Wars would be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet.
Mhm.
And in order to pay for it, they say the aerospace industry says we've got to come up with a dedicated funding source. And we have. They say it's the entitlement programs,
Yep.
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net, which is in tatters today.
Mhm.
Those are the programs they're going after to move the money into the budget. But at the same time, they're going around hitting up the allies around the world, especially in NATO, right,
Mhm.
to help pay for this thing because it's so expensive. Can you comment on that?
Well, I would just say that corporate America, whether it's the war industry or anywhere else, knows no bounds, knows no limits, knows no borders. Corporations go wherever they can for a bunch of reasons. One is to extract natural resources, and borders, there's no borders for a multinational corporation. And remember, they have the best legal teams, so they can come up with any legalese or justification in order to pull this off. They go wherever labor's the cheapest. So they obviously don't care about the industrialization of the United States or the American working class, the U.S. working class. They go where they can pay an absolute pittance, cents on the hour, in order to exploit the worker internationally and bring more money to the U.S. corporate elite, the C-suite, and Wall Street. And so it's another way for them to make money. And so they see, for example, as you mentioned, NATO, they see NATO allies as another way to profit. So one of the driving forces for the expansion of NATO was U.S. corporate profit. And this is illustrated very well in Andrew Coburn's new book, The Spoils of War, which just came out from Verso Press. And so I recommend to any of your viewers to pick it up. He chronicles very well how corporate America and the Pentagon, for its own parochial reasons, they've been very excited about the expansion of NATO because of the profits and the bureaucratic might that it brings in.
One other thing I want to bring up, because I think it illustrates everything you're saying, is when Trump was president in 2020, he brought forward the proposal to create the U.S. Space Force, a new branch of the military. When it went to the House of Representatives, the Democrats at that time, as they do today, they control the House. They could have stopped this thing dead in the tracks, right?
Yeah.
But the only thing they asked was to call it the Space Corps, like the Marine Corps. And then they went ahead and voted for it anyway. So this is the kind of corruption that we're seeing today that is endemic in Washington. And it's largely, I think, ultimately because, as you're well illustrating, the Congress is controlled by the corporate money, not just the military corporate money, but the banking industry, the resource extraction industry, the big pharma, you name it. But they own our government. And, Mussolini talked about the definition of fascism was the wedding of corporations and government. And it sure looks to me like that's what we have today.
Well said, well said. And an argument can be made that we have lived in a fascist nation under that definition since the establishment of the National Security Act in 1947, which essentially entrenched the military, industrial, congressional complex, welded it all together, and we've been living there ever since.
All right, so we've got just a few minutes left. Let's get down to the nitty gritty here. Let's talk about how we get out from behind the 8 ball. What do we do to blunt this drive for endless war, for using space as a delivery mechanism for war? How do we deal with this?
So in previous presentations, I've tried to put an optimistic face on things and try to be more of an encouraging presence. But I'm going to be rather blunt now. Our options are fairly straightforward. We either create a new economic system that cares for the working class and the natural world, or we die as a species from the environmental destruction that we have wrought, whether it's in the form of the 6th great extinction that we're living through right now and causing, or climate change, or a combination of both, or nuclear war. I mean, we have come very close to nuclear annihilation by our own systems over the years since 1945. And a investigative journalist by the name of Schlosser illustrates this very well in his book, Command and Control. So the way we get out of it is through organization and education, but that takes time. So even in a best case scenario, if we were to all unite and organize and educate, we would still, we've kicked the can down the road on this for so long. And not to say that many people haven't tried. This isn't to say that, the movement in the 60s and 70s wasn't valiant and that the ongoing peace movement and anti-war movement isn't valiant. It should be done, and we should continue to do that. However, keep organizing, keep educating, because it's the right thing to do. It's the moral imperative. But we must also realize that there's a chance that we've lost the battle, and the battle being conversion from war industry to civilian industries, to industries that meet human need and the needs of the natural world. And in that process, we would extricate ourselves from a fascist state, as you mentioned. So I would say our species faces overlapping disasters that result from the polluting, detached from nature activities of our industrial society. And we mentioned them: climate change, sixth mass extinction, unimaginable biodiversity loss, even from the 70s. I mean, we're facing 70 and 80% in some areas of ecosystems. So, and we're not getting off of fossil fuels anytime soon. Even if we put our disgusting consumer needs to the side, our entire food production and delivery system is built upon fossil fuels. So even if we wanted to, that's going to take some time. So either way, we're in for a very rocky road up ahead. And so how to blunt this drive? Continue organizing for economic conversion, continue peace efforts at the local and federal level, try to build an economic system that is not profit over people, that actually takes care of the working class. But just as importantly, we must prepare locally for collapse, economic collapse, environmental collapse, start planning as well how to react locally in the event that federal forces during collapse are unable or unwilling to respond to compounding crises.
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
We're down to 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that keeps you going personally? Talk personally now. That's a dark picture, but it's true. Everything you're saying is absolutely true. Yeah. What keeps you going in this period?
It is the moral imperative. I mean, we have the absolute, history's on our side, and we're doing the right thing, and that's enough to keep going. And there are days that are better than others, and there's a lot of bumps in the road, but we absolutely go down swinging. That's if you get into the ring against the war industry, it's you're going to get pummeled. But do the right thing, and maybe there's a chance that humanity down the road, in one form or another, will survive. And that's it's the moral imperative, and that's I wish I had a more eloquent response, but that's what we need to do. And the key is just a different economic system, even if we just pull it off locally or regionally.
Well, I would say you've been extremely eloquent, Christian.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on this show.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was very special.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching another edition of Space Alert. We'll do another show next month with another one of our leaders in the peace and space movement from around the world. Until then, good luck to you all, and please get organized. And be sure to like this video. You had to have liked and appreciated what Christian said, so please like it. And check out our website at spaceforpeace.org. Go to the video section in the menu and look at the videos that Will Griffin is making every month. Thank you. Bye-bye.